Thank you very much. I remember Ambassador Karonko was a very forceful ambassador in Tanzania, and it's a pleasure that you are the moderator of this session. Thank you to the Kalevi Sorsa Foundation for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. Unlike President Halonen, who met you after lunch, I am meeting you after President Halonen, and that, I must say, is quite a challenge. Take this as a presentation of a perspective from the floor. I am a bureaucrat, I'm a civil servant, I'm on the workshop floor inside one of the European Union institutions, actually the youngest institution, the External Action Service, which is supposed to be a European Ministry for Foreign Affairs, but we weren't allowed to call ourselves that because of the Brits. And it's servicing the needs of Lady Ashton, who has a dual capacity. She is the Vice President of the Commission, and she is the High Representative for Foreign Policy. Now, the Commission, most of the Commission work is supranational. These are where us as member states, we have delegated to the European Union to exercise power on our behalf. And the most typical area for that is trade policy. We don't have national trade policies anymore. We have the European Union trade policy. While her function as a high representative is the intergovernmental function, which is more horizontal. So it's a different character of accountability, of decision making, of the influence of the member states and their policies. So where her responsibilities meets the horizontal and vertical, that is where we are. And this makes it very tricky to understand what you can do. And it makes it tricky to be a civil servant in this system. And it doesn't help when democracy is like a diamond. You turn it around and there's different colors in every angle. There's so many understandings as to what it can be. I will try to give you a feeling for what it looks like from my perspective, what I'm working on. And I'm placed in a Directorate for Human Rights and Democracy, which is a horizontal policy function inside the External Action Service. So the content of this, and I'll try to do it quickly so that you can get back on track on your agenda. The legal basis, a bit about the link human rights democracy from our perspective, the current policies we are trying to implement, the new concept of deep democracy, the pilot countries where we're testing new working methodologies, the instruments we have, most important of them is the EIDHR, the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights, and the latest kid on the block, the European Endowment for Democracy, and some of the challenges, but I've already heard this morning that you can identify so many more challenges than I can, and a short Q&A. When life gets really complicated, to me it's a comfort to go back to the treaty, and in particular Article 3 and Article 21 of the Treaty of the European Union. The aim of the Union is to promote peace, its values, and the well-being of its people. And the action on the international scene shall be guided by principles which have inspired its own creation: democracy, the rule of law, universality and indivisibility of human rights and fundamental freedoms. When you're out in the woods and you're uncertain about what you are discussing, it's a comfort to be able to fall back on this where there is actually full political agreement. That is why it is our treaty. When I started working in the area of democracy, which was not a chosen specialization, I'm a diplomat, I intended to be a generalist, I tended to hear the concept of liberal democracy a lot of times. And I couldn't really figure out what it was, because liberal is a good thing and democracy is a good thing, so liberal democracy must be a very good thing. As you proceed in this discussion, and you have confusing debates inside the Union and outside the Union with people who have completely different reference frames, you can see that it boils down to three concentric circles of understanding. So in the core, there would be a procedural definition. If you have elections, you have democracy. Happy with that. Or there is a liberal definition. If you protect civil and political rights, we have democracy. We have liberal democracy. Happy with that. I always felt that this did not really reflect what the European Union and its member states are about. So it was important to recognize that we need to reflect the full set of human rights. So a social or a substantive definition would be Yes, civil and political rights, but also economic and social rights. And I think in practice, even if these 28 member states look very different, they are welfare states. There is a fundamental value of citizens being inside a community, not falling outside. Your debate today has shown that this is under challenge. It's not my mandate to discuss that, but I can see that the work we try to do is within the confines of an understanding of democracy, where we're trying to look at its weaknesses and assist in overcoming those weaknesses. But your debate was actually showing that it's under challenge. So what we're working on maybe isn't the issue today. I can't go into that, but I recognize the importance of what you're talking about, because that will be very important for our ability to function effectively. So these concentric circles, if you translate them to human rights, would look like this. The center is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Then there are the civil and political rights, and then there are economic, social, and cultural rights. For us, they are mutually supportive, they are interdependent, and they are on the same level of importance. There are many actors: the member states, the council, its working groups, the External Action Service, the Commission, the EU delegations, the parliaments. Everybody has a different mandate. And the accountability chains aren't obvious all the time. And this makes it confusing. And if you then add a political discourse like the one you have had and the various representatives of ideologies that comes forward, it is not an easy thing to navigate on this map. The Lisbon Treaty did some things to make us more efficient and more punchy. The HRVP Lady Ashton was appointed. The External Action Service was initiated 1st of January 2011. It includes all the EU delegations. Before, there used to be the Commission delegations, so the extension of the supranational mandate. Now they are like embassies, so they also represent the intergovernmental part of our institutions. There's a Directorate for Human Rights and Democracy, and we are incorporating the Common Security and Defense Policy and the Common Foreign and Security Policy. Coming to the policies on democracy support. The Swedish EU presidency in 2009, with strong support from Finland and other important member states, adopted Council conclusions on democracy support in the EU's external relations. It ended with operational clauses saying, please start working on this. The clauses were defined in the annex, the EU Agenda for Action on Democracy Support, and we're still working on them. The next very important policy document was adopted in December 2011 by Lady Ashton. It's a human rights policy that's supposed to permeate everything that the European Union does. That's internal and external. It's Commission and it's the others. She's talking about this being a silver thread going through all our activities, a golden standard of what we're doing. It should make a real difference for people, and it should be efficient using the instruments we have, and it should be manifest by us having focal persons in all our delegations and also in all the services. For this to actually get some punch, it was followed up 6 months later by a strategic framework and an action plan taken by the Council in June 2012. I've never seen anything quite like it, and I must say, being part of this as a civil servant, I'm really proud of it. It's concrete, it's identifying what we're supposed to do, it's identifying who's responsible, there is timelines, and there is an inter-service group set up where everybody is meeting to hold everybody else accountable. So there you sit in front of your colleagues and you have to define and defend why things haven't been done. It's quite an effective tool of making an institution move. And if you'd like to see what we're doing, the reporting on this comes out in the annual report on human rights and democracy, which is presented to the Parliament in June every year. Other recent policies, just very quickly, ENP is the European neighbourhood, DEV is development, and And development, of course, being the most important foreign policy instrument where we really can back up our ideas of our values. These are important new policies that we need to work on. In the neighbourhood policies which came in May 2011 as responses to the changes in Northern Africa, the so-called Arab Spring, now called the Arab Awakening, included two important things. One was the concept of deep democracy, and the other one was the European Endowment for Democracy. We asked Lady Ashton at a meeting, where did this concept of deep democracy come from? And she claimed to be the author herself. I have taken the definition out of the communication document. So it's about providing greater support to partners engaged in building deep democracy, the kind that lasts, because the right to vote is accompanied by rights to exercise free speech, form competing political parties, receive impartial justice, be secure, have accountable police and army forces, etc. Things that Europeans tend to take for granted. What you can see here is that this corresponds to a more liberal definition of democracy, being civil and political rights. She recognizes there is no set model or ready-made recipe for political reform, but they include free and fair elections, freedom of association, rule of law, fight against corruption, etc. So this has been the emphasis of the policies that we are now working on in relation to the neighborhoods, mostly south but also eastern. When it comes to the Swedish Council conclusions and the request to implement them, the Council identified 12 countries as pilot countries where we were to test new working methodologies. These were the countries. The bold are the 9 that actually participated. There were 6 action areas. We should develop country-specific approaches, should be based on dialogue and partnership. So the language changed from democracy promotion to democracy support, with the thinking that promotion carries with it an idea that you can sell a product and you can push it onto a political market, and it is competing with other political ideas. Well, if this is a fundamental value for us, we do not recognize the legitimacy of other political systems. So we changed the language to democracy support. EU needs to work on the coherence of its instruments. So we don't run in different directions with political dialogue versus development cooperation and other instruments. We also need to get more impact of our values, and that's done through mainstreaming in activity areas which maybe doesn't look like they are about democracy support. You can still raise issues about consultation, about consensus building. It's pretty much about working modalities. There's an emphasis on international cooperation, in particular with the UN, and it's important for the EU to be visible. Well, we started. The results and conclusions is that we requested these delegations to do democracy profiles and democracy action plans. And what the first generation showed after a year of work was that we were given more information in the democracy profiles on institutions and processes. Now, this is more information in comparison to human rights strategies, which tend to reflect what are in the human rights conventions. So it provided synergies with human rights strategies. It gave us more knowledge about context. It assisted in defining areas for programming, that is development cooperation, and it assisted in providing content for the political dialogues. So it was a useful exercise, but it didn't go far enough, and the 9 reports that came in were very different. So this is pointing to the need to continue, which is what we are supposed to do now. We'll launch it by the end of this year and see if we can get a little bit more clarity in what we're talking about. And then this should go global. The annual report on human rights and democracy is where you can follow what we are doing, where any citizen can follow what we are doing. The format as from this year is following the action plan, so it should be easy to see. These are the commission, these are the promises that we have made of what we are supposed to achieve, and this is our assessment of what has happened. Instruments, yeah, I think I mentioned them. The European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights is the instrument for very political ambitions, in particular in support for human rights, but increasingly more in support also of democracy. It's about €1 billion over a 7-year period, and in total 0.78% of our aid, so very small, but can also be very critical because it doesn't require consent of the host country. It's often used to support human rights activists and people who are really fighting for these values and need European support in order to essentially survive in their contexts. It's been campaigns against the death penalty, support of human rights defenders, election observation, and in 2011 that was the first global call on democracy. Key areas for support: electoral processes, civic education, media, parliaments, political pluralism and political parties, and domestic accountability mechanisms. So as you can see, this is pretty much a development perspective looking at institutions and their functionality. The European Endowment for Democracy, an idea launched in May 2011, negotiated among the member states during 2011 and 2012. The executive director was hired in January this year. He's a former Polish state secretary called Jerzy Pomianowski. It is a private law foundation under Belgian law, if we are going to be very formal. So it's not an EU institution, it's not an EU instrument, but it's most certainly an initiative from the political bodies of the EU. In the Board of Governors, there are 28 representatives of the member states. There are 7 or so members of the European Parliament. There are 3 civil society representatives. And the Board of Governors elect an executive committee of 7 who are the people who actually make decisions. They started operations 1st of July. They made their first set of decisions end of September. It's a small operation with a staff of 13 people, and they're focusing on the neighbourhood countries, so 15 countries in total in the southern and the eastern neighbourhood. And the slogan is supporting the unsupported. The budget is covering 27 million euros, out of which 10 comes from the European Commission. So this is an interesting experiment. We'll see where it goes. As always, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. And let me then just quickly highlight a new initiative by 16 universities globally, based at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, and the major funders are the European Commission and Sweden, on how to measure democracy. This is interesting because it's much broader than Freedom House measures, than polity measures and other political science measures. They have collected 10 million data points over 140 countries, and you will be able to use it as from January next year. And there will be graphic systems where you can enter questions on relationships between, for example, the introduction of a law in a country, and you can see the effects that then comes on civil society development and freedom of speech and other things. So it will show correlations and developments over time. I find this really interesting, and I hope it will fly. It will certainly be part of our work, since the EU has invested a lot of money in it. The real challenge today, compared to when I worked at IDEA, is the internal-external coherence. You've heard a lot about it today. It was much easier just a few years ago to talk about value-based issues from the basis of the European Union towards other countries, because our house was in order. To me, it looks like our house is under severe stress. There are issues like minority issues, the treatment of the Roma people in certain countries, but there is also the financial crisis and its effects and challenges on the welfare states. It's the poverty levels in some of our member states, it's the youth unemployment. All this affects our credibility when we are moving outside of our union, trying to work and promote our fundamental values. This is a much bigger challenge than what it was before. And what is, from a perspective of a civil servant, is really, really important is that you people who are politically active speak out. The impact might not be immediate, but the impact comes over time. Main challenges. What democracy are we talking about? Is it a liberal democracy or a social democracy or a deliberative democracy or a participatory democracy? It's very complex, and the material is more political than technical, and it has a lot to do with ideology and values. We often mix institutional solutions with principles. I think President Talonen was talking about electoral systems and how different systems, while representing our principles, can give such different outcomes. This is very important, and it's something that needs to be more common knowledge than what it is today. There's a lot more rhetoric than substance, in my opinion, in what the EU is doing. It's easy for us to say democracy and human rights. If you go to the next level, when it comes to the human rights, we can refer to the conventions. When it comes to democracy, we are vaguer. How to do it is a challenge. It's not about importing or exporting systems. It's about supporting efforts of democrats in other countries. How do you do that in the right manner? Promotion, well, we already discarded that, but I can see that's still part of our language. Is it building? Is it support? We need to be comprehensive. This is a multi-actor activity, and it's a long-term activity. It's also fairly easy to define who are the real democracies and who are not. But what about everybody in between? It's like the judgment of an election. We're talking about free and fair elections. That's the same. Most elections are not free and fair. They have problems here and there. How do you convey the gray zone issues? How do you deal with them? Internal issues. Coherence remains an issue. There is one set of working practices if you're in development cooperation. There's another set of practices if you're working in the common foreign and security policy. Sometimes these goes at cross purposes. The integration of human rights and democracy is not easy. Human rights is legalistic. It fits our institutions very well because they are also legalistic. They found democracy people fluffy and undecisive and undefined. Yet democracy is the space where you can discuss the things that are undefined and the things that you need to challenge today. So it has to be developed as its own working area. External issues, the internal coherence, external coherence. I mentioned the double standards. It's often about values versus interests. And the energy crisis, for example, shows this. Are we caving in because we need oil from authoritarian states? Does that mean that we are lowering our voice on our value issues or not? And then the issue about the West. What we are preaching, is it universal or is it particular to our case? Well, we're safe as long as we can refer to human rights instruments as universally acceptable. But when we move to democracy, it's easy to get into a gray zone where we are questioned. And so there's a lot of conceptual work that needs to be done as well. I think that actually is a good bridge over to Milja and the conceptual discussion. And I wish to thank you for listening to me, and thank you for having invited me to this meeting.
Thank you, Ingrid. And now there is a place for a few questions, immediate questions, if somebody would like to ask. Sari has got the floor over there. Can you take the... Sari Varpama. She represents the parliamentary democracy organization called DEMO here in Finland. Please, Sari.
Yes, thank you. Yes, Political Parties of Finland for Democracy, DEMO Finland, that we have met before. We were, as part of the European Partnership for Democracy, involved with the drawing of the Council conclusions during the Czech presidency at the time. And I was interested in hearing your overlook of where you are at the moment with democracy support in the EU. And coming back to drawing on lessons learned, I would like to hear a bit more about what you're going to do next in this regard. You said something was happening now in 2013, so could you give a bit more insight into what is happening in that regard? And also I'd like to hear your views on EED a bit more. How is that going to be complementing the existing instruments? And as I know you are well aware of the administrative problems or challenges to do with the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights. So is there anything that is happening in that regard to make it a bit easier for organizations to apply for EU funding and to actually administer these funds in the target countries? So those were really the points I wanted to ask you about. The other thing is, you said, is it about the West? And of course, democracy is not about the West. If we look at the UN resolutions, it's quite clear that democracy is actually desirable by most countries in the world. And if you look at the Arab barometer, it's more valued in many of those countries than it's valued here in the West. So I would like to go along with Thomas Carothers on this and say that, yes, we do need to stand up for our values in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you, Sari. Ingrid, please.
Yeah. I would agree with your last statement, and maybe it's important for us in our comfortable lives to actually remind ourselves where we are coming from ourselves and what we risk losing if we're losing it. Having said that, what will happen during 2013? Well, from my perspective, you would find my answer very bureaucratic. It's identifying a second generation of pilot countries. It's doing good and proper guidelines for democracy profiles so that we can prove with the next generation that this should be global and standard and be done everywhere. It's backing it up with proper training, identifying the existing training modules and defining them, and trying to go deeper into more specific training on what is democracy and how do you work with it. There is a task force which is comprised of development people and human rights people from all the member states. I'd like to have it revitalized. So, because there are member states with very interesting experiences, and one of the real raison d'etre for the EAS is that it's replacing the rotating presidencies. So the EAS has to learn how to benefit from the member states. Some are well ahead of the EU institutions, there you can learn. Some are behind. You have a responsibility to pull them into the community. I'll try to build up another task force more internally, because looking at the resources that are set aside for democracy in the EAS, we're 2 people in my division in our directorate. Then it's all over the place. It's nowhere near the rhetorical importance of democracy, so you have to be really good at choosing what you're doing to have any impact. But it's in the mandate of anybody who works on a country desk. And if these people could be pulled together, we could also get more punch and probably be better at filtering and securing the various experiences that are coming out, because they are very different depending on the geographic regions. And I understand from, in particular, the southern neighborhood that these delegations and these colleagues have really been confronted with democracy issues in a very real sense with the changes during the Arab awakening. The European Endowment for Democracy and Complementarity. Yes, it's there. They started working. It's really up to them to prove that they are complementary. They spend now a lot of time talking to the institutions, and in particular those who are working on the EIDHR, because these two are really the same family. So if the EIDHR is there to support human rights defenders and the EED is there to support political activists, what's the difference? The practice will show. Supporting the unsupported, well, with all the instruments that we have and the member states have, are there still people who are unsupported? Well, apparently there was when the Arab awakening happened. And they are now busy visiting these neighborhood countries to find these activists. They have one, if I'm just paraphrasing what they're telling me, they supported a private media TV station in Azerbaijan in view of the elections. The one which revealed that the election results were in an app even before the election started. That I would consider a good use of money in support of democracy, but we'll see. So they're well aware of the need to be complementary.
Thank you, Ingrid. This has covered all the other consequent immediate questions. So the next speaker is Milja Kurki. She's a professor at the Aberystwyth University in Wales, in Britain. And you're most welcome. And I think, Milja, you can speak from here.
Oh.
Oh, would you like to sit down there? Okay, yes. This is okay, yes, very good. And although she is a professor in international relations theory, she has in practice studied European Union democracy processes, and she's just told over the lunch that she was very enthusiastic when looking upon the European Union practices, and now she has also got a second opinion. Please.
Absolutely. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yep. Good. Excellent. Okay, what I'm going to try to do is be a little bit more spontaneous than I was planning, partly because I want to try to connect some of the discussions from earlier today about conceptions of democracy, ideas about democracy, with debate about democracy promotion, so concrete policy practice, foreign policy practice. I've been running a project into the so-called conceptual politics of democracy promotion for the last fair few years, 4 years or so, and this is a project that's been delivered for the European Research Council. And the aim of this has been to ask the difficult questions that Ingrid already has made reference to, the questions about the implications of the conceptual problems with the idea of democracy, what that means actually for the practice of democracy promotion activity. The argument of the project is that there are certain conceptual problems at the heart of democracy promotion activity, and as such, the problems of democracy promotion then are not always merely practical problems, or problems of lack of political will, or problems of delivery methods per se. Actually, underpinning practical problems are often conceptual problems, and if we address some of those problems straight on, perhaps we can actually deliver and think about different kinds of democracy promotion activity too. So what I'll try to do is talk a little bit about EU towards the end, and the kind of problems of democracy promotion in the EU, but I'll preface it by saying something about conceptions of democracy to start off with. And I want to specifically address the difficult question of what are the implications of the really problematic characteristic of the concept of democracy for democracy promotion. There are two main problems that arise from the concept of democracy for the very idea of democracy promotion. The first problem is that democracy is an inherently malleable concept. It's a socially constructed concept, it's a socially defined and historically defined concept. Its meaning only arises out of very particular historical, social and political sets of circumstances. And as such, democracy's meaning keeps shifting. It moves across time. It changes as it hits different places in the world. And this is a really important thing to take to keep in mind when we think about the concept of democracy. It's not an object, it's not a thing, it's not a commodity, it's not a product, it's not a thing that we can discuss in fixed terms. So if that's one problem with the idea of democracy, and if it forces us to think about historical shifts in the very meaning of democracy across time, perhaps it's the case that representative liberal democracy designed in the 19th century is not, perhaps it's the case that it's not really the concept of democracy that actually animates political actors on the ground. Perhaps it's not the concept of democracy that is actually capable of addressing the problems of decision-making in a globalizing world. Maybe it's something like global democracy that we should be thinking about today to actually have a meaningful concept of democracy. These are the kinds of questions that are raised first by the malleability, historical contextuality of the concept of democracy. But the other problem, I think, is a deeper problem. And this is really the problem of contestability of the concept of democracy. Democracy is a contested concept. In political science classes, first thing you'll hear is that democracy is the most paradigmatic example of an essentially contested concept. Now, what essential contestability means is that there is no universal definition. It's it's impossible for there to be a universally agreed upon definition of the idea of democracy. Instead, what essential contestability forces us to think about is the fact that whenever you define democracy, whether you define it as liberal democracy or social democracy or participatory democracy or radical democracy or cosmopolitan democracy and so on, you're actually defining it in an ideologically value-driven sense. And as such, whenever we talk about democracy, we're talking about different value systems. We're talking about different ideological and political sets of values. And taking this into account, really, is a great difficulty, I think, of the idea of democracy promotion. Because once you start thinking about promoting democracy, assisting democracy, supporting democracy, however locally definable or contextual those understandings are, you're having to make assumptions about what counts as democracy when we see it. Who are the democratic actors that we look for out there, and how do we identify them? My argument would be that whenever we define democracy, whenever we engage in democracy promotion practice, we're also making political judgments, ideological judgments about who are the right kinds of actors, who are democratic actors in developing countries, but also in our own countries, if you like. So the key problem for me in approaching the issue of democracy promotion is this conceptual queries about the malleability and contestability, essential contestability of the concept of democracy. What does that mean for democracy promotion, and how would that be taken into account in democracy promotion? The idea that I want to suggest is that there are questions that need to be asked of democracy promotion that are not simply the strategic ones or the technical ones about why was there an intervention in Libya but not in Syria? What are the problems of particular forms of military intervention in places like Iraq? Should we be looking for civil society support or governmental structural support or something else? Those kinds of questions are not the only types of questions. Rather, I think it would be interesting to ask different types of questions about democracy promotion and its consequences. Whose democracy is promoted by the EU in the Ukraine? Is it the vision of all democratic actors in Ukraine? When there's a developmental policy intervention in Ghana, whose democracy, which democratic actors emerge as the kind of actors that are worked with? What political consequences arise from the kinds of conceptual underpinnings that may actually underpin the often nowadays very technical policy instruments of democracy promotion? Democracy promotion is not a technical foreign policy area. It's an inherently political, ideological foreign policy area. So hence asking these types of questions I think are very, very important. Now what we tried to do in the study that we've been conducting in Aberystwyth is to try to get a first stab, if you like, at asking some of those conceptual questions. So what are the conceptual underpinnings of democracy promotion activity as it exists out there? We've looked at numbers of different types of actors for the study. So we've looked in detail at the US democracy promotion scene, not just the US State Department, but also the USAID and various other instruments within the US democracy promotion scene. We also looked at the EU in some detail, and particularly the Commission and EAS and the EIDHR, the civil society funding instrument, as well as some aspects of neighbourhood policy. We then also looked at NGO actors, civil society actors, political foundations, and their activity in democracy promotion, as well as the role of various international monetary and financial organizations, who also, of course, promote democracy, even though often that promotion of democracy doesn't happen under openly, the language of openly talking about the idea of democracy, but often they discuss governance mechanisms, for example. So what do we find? What are the conceptual foundations, the ideological currents of thought that underpin democracy promotion practice? This is where we try to get with the study. And we find out all kinds of rather interesting things, and I won't go into the details of the different aspects of different actors' democracy promotion, but I'll just try to give you a sense of the kind of highlights, if you like, of the study. I think the key highlight is that despite all the talk in democracy promotion at the moment about the need for locally contextualized, locally owned democracy, and despite all the talk about multiple paths to democracy, as a premise for democracy assistance and democracy support. In fact, in democracy promotion practice, there is an ideological consensus, a convergence, if you like, of views towards a very particular model of democracy, a very particular set of ideas about what defines the key values, the key institutions, and also the key spheres of influence of democratic decision-making. And that model of democracy is actually, perhaps not very surprisingly, a fairly classical liberal model of democracy. Classical liberal model of democracy where elections, constitutional rights, and so on provide the core content for the idea of democracy. Liberty of the individual is the key constitutional right that democracy should stand for. Now, this is all very fine, you might say. But of course, what's interesting about the classical liberal model being the guiding point ideologically, politically, of democracy promotion activity is that it comes together with particular visions about what's in and what's out. So what's out of liberal democracy are conceptions of democracy that define the sphere of the economic as a sphere that should actually be dictated by democratic sets of decision-making procedures. Out goes social democracy, out goes participatory models of democracy, out go various radical models of democracy, out go also certain Islamic conceptions of democracy, whatever you might think of the purchase of those kinds of ways of thinking about the meaning of democracy. So the significance of the finding, in a sense, is to highlight the fact that there are particular orientations in democracy promotion practice. It is not a neutral activity, a technical activity, but at the heart of it, it's about molding societies in accordance with particular ideas of the good life, as the President was referring to previously. Now, it's absolutely the case that in the last couple of years there have been moves in democracy promotion towards trying to take account of the problem of the markets. So the idea that the market is a separate sphere and democratic decision-making shouldn't intervene in it, the classical liberal idea of separation of economics and politics, this has been seen to be pretty problematic. So even in the United States State Department, there are now interesting discussions, some of which we've been involved in, discussions about how do we implement, how do we think up a different definition of liberal democracy, one that actually touches base with some concern about overrun capitalism, if you like, overdoing the economic liberty bit. How do we have a liberal democratic model of governance that actually controls, partially at least, economic policy-making processes? So you have a shift to what you might call a reform liberal understanding of liberal democracy, even in the United States State Department. At the same time, as in other sections of the United States government democracy promotion thinking, there are actually shifts in the other direction. So return to what you might call a Bushian, kind of a Hayekian model of radically liberal democracy. So you actually have a strange fragmentation in democracy promotion community of what is thought about the idea of democracy. That's no surprise, of course, because in society we also have a fragmentation about what we mean by the concept of democracy today. The concept of democracy of the Occupy Wall Street movement is not the same as the concept of democracy of a classical liberal democratic party, for example. But what's interesting about democracy promotion is that you have a partial fragmentation, even within democracy promotion, of the idea of what liberal democracy absolutely means. But at the same time, for us, it's been interesting to note that while there's partial fragmentation of the conceptual underpinnings of democracy promotion, there hasn't been a reorientation towards thinking about multiplicities of different ways of conceptualizing democracy. So there hasn't been particularly sets of questions asked about, is Islamic a model of democracy, a valid model of democracy? Is social democracy a model of democracy that still has some validity? Are participatory models of democracy actually the way to go in democracy promotion? Instead, there's a tendency to converge towards the middle or the kind of lowest common denominator, if you like, understanding of democracy, which is liberal democracy. Now, that would be all very well if there weren't consequences, if you like, to those kinds of decisions to ignore the conceptual contestation in society, but also in international politics about models of democracy. And this is probably where I should bring in the EU briefly. Now, EU, of course, is a fascinating democracy promotion actor to look at, not only because of the complexity of what the EU does in democracy promotion. There are multiple instruments, many of them very successful. I think I would say EU is, in some sense, is the most successful democracy promotion organization that there is. But conceptually, ideologically, it's a very interesting actor too. Partly because, of course, in Europe we have such a rich tradition of different traditions of thinking about the concept of democracy. In Europe, democracy has never been a singular concept. There have always been multiple traditions, rich historical traditions of thinking about democracy, either in a somewhat more social democratic way or liberal democratic way, or sometimes also in terms of participatory democracy or radical democracy even, and so on. Now, what's interesting for me is that when you study EU democracy promotion as it is currently presented, that richness of the traditions of democracy that are inherent in the EU are not really coming through in the practice. There is a discourse amongst the promoters of democracy in the EU that EU promotes 27 different models of democracy. Now, that rhetoric, I would say, is not much more than that. It's a rhetorical tool to indicate that EU is open to multiple ways of thinking about democracy. But actually, in the practices and technicalities of EU democracy promotion delivery, there's a real wish to actually depoliticize debates about democracy's potentially multiple sets of meanings. In fact, most of the actors that I've interviewed and talked to say that it's dangerous to open up political debate about what democracy means today. Instead, technical instruments, technical delivery of support, aid to civil society groups and so on should be the focus of activity. Now, this is a bit of a problem, I would say, for EU democracy promotion, because most beneficiaries in target countries actually look to the EU to exactly learn more about things like social democracy. They can't go to the US and ask for a more social democratic model, partly because the US openly says we don't promote social democracy. But surely in Europe there should be a model of social democratic thinking, even participatory democratic thinking that these developing democratic actors could turn to. At the moment, I don't feel that that's been made a great deal out of, actually, partly because of the need to and tendency to want to bureaucratize, technicalize, depoliticize what Europe actually stands for in democracy promotion. There's another consequence to this particular need to depoliticize, to technicalize the area of democracy promotion, I think. And one of the consequences, I think, has to do with the maintenance, inadvertent maintenance, if you like, of actually a particular form of neoliberal democratization within Europe. In some of the activities in neighbourhood areas, for example, when we're talking about action plans for democratization in Ukraine and so on, what you actually inadvertently get with the EU is an implicit form of almost neoliberal democracy promotion, where democracy and human rights values and discussions and dialogue over them actually becomes reduced to delivery of particular kinds of economic instruments for the privatization of the economic realm, and the two things kind of start to hang together. So one of the real downsides, I would say, of EU democracy promotion at present is that politicization, escaping from the language of the depoliticized classical liberal consensus on democracy, would actually allow the EU to make more of the type of social democracy and democratic activity that it would actually like to see in the neighbourhood. But also at the same time, I think, might be part and parcel of actually invigorating debate in Europe about democracy. Democracy promotion is an activity that takes place in foreign lands, in foreign policy, but of course at the heart of any debate about democracy promotion has to be a debate about what democracy means for the countries that actually promote it. So in exactly the same sense as there should be, and there is, more of a debate in the US about what liberal democracy means in the US. Does it mean Hayekian democracy, or does it actually mean something like return to social reformist, Galbraith type of liberal democracy? That is for the Americans to actually think on, to debate. And that debate should actually also then filter into the democracy promotion practice of that state. The same, I think, should be the case also in the EU, where really rich traditions of democratic thinking can be drawn upon to invigorate, reinvigorate, and I think enthuse, if you like, the democracy promotion community, which in my experience, having interviewed many, many democracy promotion practitioners, that community of practitioners, I think, is actually quite cynical, skeptical, downtrodden almost, partly because there's a real skepticism about whether what they're doing is actually standing up for the principles that they thought they were standing up for when they joined the democracy promotion activity in the first place. So as a result, conceptual debate, political debate about democracy's meaning in Europe, but also in democracy promotion, can hopefully open up the democracy promotion practice, enthuse the communities, but also ultimately, hopefully also contribute towards re-politicization of the concept of democracy in the countries, in the democratic countries that we live in. But I'll leave that there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Milja. After your presentation, one feels that there is a need to rewrite to the university. Thank you. And Ingrid, maybe you can respond with a short response to Milja now, what she said about how she viewed and perceived the European Union presence.
Yeah. Well, thank you for an extremely dynamic and really interesting presentation. I learned a lot about us. It's difficult to stand here and be accountable for the whole of the EU. The EU has so many faces. And when you quote some of your interviewees saying that it's dangerous to open up the political debate, I need to stress the obvious. Not all of us have a mandate to pursue political debates.
Yeah.
And that's maybe why my presentation becomes a bit boring, because when you're down the line after the political signals and your role is to interpret and be concrete, in an environment that the political signals come from right, left, and center and all over the place, you tend to look for the common denominator, and you tend to do more risk-free activities and to protect both yourself and the European Union product. So either you give civil servants more of a political mandate, which I don't think you want to, or the political society in the various parts of the European Union institutions need to become more vocal. Mm-hmm. And if it is a problem that we are liberal, more neoliberal, and that has consequences in areas which you don't like as political society, take the debate. Because at my end, it will come to people like me and what we are actually doing.
Thank you. Let's go to the audience now. Who was just there? Over there, please. And then on this side, somebody.
Thank you. My name is Tiina Kukka-Maaba from Political Parties of Democracy for Finland, Demo Finland. Thank you, Milja, for continuing this discussion we started earlier last year, and I find this discussion extremely valid. This point, how the whole approach to promoting or supporting democracy is depoliticized, and in Finland we have also looked into this when in the Finnish development policy one of the main targets is good governance. So in the name of good governance, democracy and human rights apparently supported, but good governance is more technical approach than actually supporting democracy. And this is also a very valid discussion at the moment when the Finnish Ministry for Foreign Affairs is just preparing policy on democracy support. And we commented the draft policy because they had, for example, not included political parties in the whole policy of democracy support. So there is such a huge tendency to depoliticize the whole approach. And when EU talks about deep democracy, the Finnish development policy is talking about broad democracy, which then includes almost everything. So the whole meaning of supporting democracy and the focus is kind of depoliticized and it's disappearing. So I find this discussion very interesting. It would be interesting to hear more what has been the response so far to your research. Thank you.
Let's take the second question and then leaves you to answer, please, over there. Yeah. Just, okay.
Thank you very much for both of you. Very interesting presentations, and thanks for coming here. And we can have this discussion in Finland also. What I wanted to say that I'm like coming from the field, so I'm leading a project, the democracy promotion project in Macedonia, and of course I have also faced these kind of tendencies to go to this technical approach. But I would like to ask from Milja that I have been pretty much following you after you were speaking in the demos seminar, which was a very good one, and I have been reading your text, and I have been thinking that how could I apply this in practice. So would you have any advice or recommendation what should I or any other person or organization who is promoting or supporting democracy, what they should take into account?
Okay, Milja, maybe you start and then Ingrid.
Okay, great. What shall I respond to? What has been the response? I'll take the question from the back. What has been the response to the findings? Well, very interesting one. I think we've been delivering various sets of practitioner workshops around the world, literally from the US State Department to the UN to elsewhere. And the response has been enthusiastic, partly because most practitioners do remember, of course, yes, democracy is a contested concept, and of course, they know that, actually, and they know that it's an important thing to consider. The problem is that the practicalities of every day are difficult. You work within a bureaucratic, technical set of constraints in acting in democracy promotion nowadays. The reporting requirements are such that actually mostly you're thinking about what do you write in your report rather than how can you assist necessarily a democratic country elsewhere. And partly that's part of the thing that I would like to contribute exactly to the discussion is, first of all, a discussion about delivery methods. Democracy promotion is a very particular kind of foreign policy agenda. It is not quite the same as development aid. I would not say that development aid is necessarily apolitical either, but certainly providing criteria, checklists against which you measure whether a country democratizes or not, or whether a civil society actor is a democratic actor or not, is really impossible, I think. So political responsibility has to be taken by politicians, and not just necessarily those in charge of the technical delivery per se, but actually politicians. In the European context, I think the European Parliament should do even more, and they do already quite a bit, to try to raise some of these debates about democracy. But at the same time, in the European Parliament, there is also a fear about politicization. So, for example, the Office for Parliamentary Democracy Promotion of the European Parliament is particularly interested in depoliticizing debate about democracy, because there is a fear that funding for the very idea of democracy promotion might possibly disappear as a result of politicization of debate. Similar reasons for that skepticism also exist in the US. So one thing would be a debate about delivery mechanisms and moving away from standardized sets of delivery methods in civil society provision, for example. I think there's a lot to be said about moving away from log frames. Log frame is a particular development management tool where you define what the end point of what you want to get to is, and then you define a set of mechanistic steps of how you get there. That is not democracy. If it was a linear, nice thing that you could represent in such a model, things would be very easy. But the very model of causality at the center of that model is so skewed in a sense that it's very difficult to think about democracy activity in those terms. And I think a lot of beneficiaries of democracy aid, a lot of civil society actors would like to have more flexibility in terms of how to work with the main funders, the main EU and US donors. So that's one thing. But also it would go with the politicization by donors themselves of what it is that they do, actually setting out key sets of values that they stand for. The other thing, in terms of what things can contribute to debates, but also what kind of things one could think about in terms of democracy promotion, would be prioritization of dialogues, and not necessarily training sessions, but rather dialogues, real dialogues between representatives of the democracy promotion community and those on the ground. And my experience is that political foundations are actually exactly the sites where a lot of those interesting debates are happening. And that's why, for me, what's paradoxical about looking at democracy promotion activity is that political foundations have always been at the heart of exactly the kind of democracy promotion that one would like to see, a more political form of democracy promotion that can actually engage with political actors. But paradoxically, it's exactly those types of democracy promotion actors that are being increasingly pushed out of the scene, partly because there's a danger, a perception of danger of partisanship attached to these particular kinds of actors. So more dialogues, and perhaps going back to political foundations, would be at least two suggestions to throw out there, but I'm aware of.
Maybe that was the answer also to the last question. And maybe what we should do is we should revisit the logical framework when we are talking about the democracy support programs. And Ingrid, thank you very much, and thank you very much for your presentations and for your answers to the questions. And we go for tea and coffee now, and we come back here 15:35, and then we start the panel discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you.